Welcome to Studio Fabricana. In this series, we're going to be looking at seam finishes, which will include the French seam, the flat felled seam, the zigzag finish, what I'm calling the press and stitch, the nice pinked edge, and we will end with the Hong Kong finish. This segment is going to focus on the zigzag finish, where we're zigzagging the raw edge of our seams. The other method we're going to look at, I'm calling the press and stitch method. The nice thing about these two methods is you can customize them by choosing from hundreds of colors of thread. So this is another method I'm about to show you where you use the right sides together. That nice dark denim is facing itself. We've sewn again the standard 5/8 centimeters seam. What we're going to do now is we're going to zigzag the edge of each of our seam allowances. Now this is a method that I used to use all the time before I had a serger. It was the easiest way that I found to finish that raw edge without sewing it twice with a French seam. I do love the French seam now, but at the time I would just press my seam open and then zigzag that raw edge. Now once you've pressed your seam open, fold all of the fabric away from the seam, because you want to make sure that when you're stitching, you're only sewing through the seam allowance and not through your other fabric. So I've preset my machine with the zigzag stitch. My width is 4.5 and the length is 3.0, and I found that's a really nice size for me. You may want to test your machine first on a scrap of fabric before you end up sewing through a seam and finding you're really not happy with it. But like I said, for me, the 4.5 width and the 3.0 looks pretty nice. Again, make sure you're not catching any other fabric, just your one seam allowance as you go. So here we have our finished seam allowances. We did the exact same on the one side as we did the other. Now the reason why I did this after I sewed the seam is if we actually measured the seam allowances now, we would find it's actually a little bit less than 5/8. That zigzag stitch kind of pulls that edge in a little bit. So if we had done the zigzag first and then sewn a 5/8 centimeter seam, we actually would be taking more than 5/8 off of our fabric. So it's much better for accurate sewing to sew your 5/8 centimeter seam with the raw edge and then zigzag each individual seam allowance to make sure that you have accurate sewing. So this is another method that I'm going to call press and stitch. Maybe there's another name for it, but I can't think of it right now. This is another method where we're sewing our 5/8 centimeter seam allowance with our right sides facing. Once we've sewn our seam, which we've done already, we're going to press it open. Again, I like to just work close to my iron. You could finger press this open, but I think you'll be happier, get a nice flat surface while you're working. Now, the next thing that we're going to do, why it's called press and stitch, is we're going to fold our seam allowance in half. So the raw edge of our seam allowance is going to go back towards our stitching. Kind of like we did on the flat felled method, if you check that out on a different video. And I'm just going to kind of press as I go. If you'd like to pin it in place and then press it, or kind of press it and then pin it after, whatever you're comfortable with. Just remember to take your pins out as you're sewing. You don't want to stitch over a pin. So once you have the seam allowance pressed in half, you're going to grab it by the fold, let all your fabric hang away, and then you're going to bring it to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch as close as we can to that folded edge, but just through the layers of the seam allowance, not through any of the other fabric. So note that I've got all my fabric and my other seam allowance facing away from the machine, and I'm just going to be stitching through the folded seam allowance. using a regular straight stitch and quite close to the fold. I'm just going to stitch all the way down the seam allowance. And once I've done that, I'm going to repeat the same process for my other seam allowance, and then we can look at the finished product. So now that I've done the exact same finish on the other seam allowance, here is our finished look. Now what I like about this seam finish is actually you see less of the seam allowance, like if you were having an unlined garment, maybe a jacket that you were going to see the inside of. Instead of having 5/8 of an inch seam allowances showing, you would just have this nice kind of narrower, about half that amount on each side, which I think is a very nice tailored look.